For fans, Jimmy Page is like a rock music hero from Led Zeppelin. But there's something you probably never knew about him. He never forgives anyone who hurts the music world that he thinks is special. It was like getting in trouble and going to jail if they got caught with music from the 1960s. And for more than 50 years, he stayed quiet. No complaints. But he remembered every name, every song he thought was fake. And now at 81 years old, he has decided to tell everyone. 6 guitar players who made him want to throw his guitar on the ground and leave the music studio. Big egos, backstabbing, and pure hate. This is Jimmy Page like you've never seen him before, Eric Clapton. Jimmy Page never had to yell that he hates Eric Clapton. Just hearing someone say that name in an interview, his face would get cold enough to make the whole room go quiet. To him it wasn't jealousy, it was hate, burning and never forgiving, like a cut that never heals under the skin of British rock music. Clapton was called a prophet. Clapton is God. They wrote it on walls, drew it in bathroom stalls, wrote it on notebook covers. And Page just smiled and said something mean and cutting. If that's God, then I'd rather play with my head than with an empty heart like that. To him, Clapton wasn't a genius, just a blues player with 3 simple tricks, playing them over and over until he died. The honesty that people praised. To Page, it was just an excuse to hide being lazy. And then one time in the studio in 1965, when someone mentioned Clapton, he gave a look as sharp as a knife and said quickly without raising his voice, "He's got 3 blues tricks in his pocket, and he'll use them until the day he dies." That wasn't just criticism. It was like a punishment, a mean shrug, as if Clapton was just a bad rough draft the newspapers were too lazy to throw away. Things got even worse when Clapton quietly took drummer Jim Gordon, who Page had planned to use for his own album, into his own band without saying a word. To Page, that wasn't just stealing. It was backstabbing wrapped up in fake politeness. And when he said in an interview, "Eric built his whole career off the backs of other people. He's really good at showing up late and taking credit for what was already halfway done." People understood this wasn't just a personal fight. It was a statement. Clapton only knows how to pick up glory that others left behind. Clapton, as usual, stayed quiet. But that quietness made Page angry. In his eyes, it wasn't noble calm. It was the cold thinking of someone who knew he had no good answer left, but still wanted to pretend he was standing tall. And the more quiet Clapton stayed, the more it made Page's anger burn, because he knew very well that's what weak people do. When Led Zeppelin became huge like a music storm shaking a whole generation, Page jumped headfirst into complicated music structures, turning each guitar part into something like a temple. Meanwhile, Clapton went into sleepy, slow songs and drugs. One built music that would last forever. The other wrote sorry notes on his guitar for giving up. And when Clapton casually said, "I like things that are a bit more real," to Page, it was like a slap wrapped in silk. A comment that seemed gentle, but was full of poison. Led Zeppelin wasn't real, not honest, had no soul. Page didn't get angry. He just waited. Then at a party in Notting Hill, when someone carelessly mentioned Clapton, he raised his glass, eyes looking at it as if the world no longer existed, and said coldly, "I don't play in the background for anyone." A statement that hit like a nail, hammered into stone. Page stood behind no one, especially not someone like Clapton. In 1983, when the Arms concert was organized to raise money for charity, the organizers imagined a duet between 2 guitar legends. Clapton said yes. Page said no, no explanation, no sign of being nicer. And as if by fate, they never shared a stage, no handshake, no making up, only emptiness, cold as ice, built on purpose through ignoring each other on purpose. At events honoring Clapton, Page was always missing. No congratulations letters, no tribute videos. For him, not being there was a statement. It wasn't refusing. It was a quiet judgment. I don't go to the funeral of something I never thought was alive. Their fans split into two groups like enemy teams. One believed in raw pain, the other in smart music that lasts. But in between, Page stayed quiet, his silence sharp, echoing like a voice from a dark hole until 2010, when a bold French reporter asked directly, "After all this, what do you think of Clapton?" Page didn't frown, didn't scowl. He just sipped his tea and said something that was calm but mean. "Clapton is probably the best guitar player among those who never dared to take chances." And before anyone could react, he added, "Me? I don't play it safe." When asked if there was anything about Clapton he respected, Page shrugged, not caring, as if talking about an old record nobody wanted. He's always stayed true to himself. No growth, no change. Sometimes that's a kind of courage, too. A compliment that seemed real but tasted bitter because everyone understood. Staying the same, forever, is also a way to die while standing still. This war has no end, no fighting, no announcements, only distance. Every time Page doesn't show up to a Clapton event, every cold look, every brutally honest comment disguised as an observation, all of it forms a quiet crack running through guitar history. Two men, two ways of playing, two beliefs, never matching, never side by side, and definitely never shaking hands. Because in Jimmy Page's eyes, true greatness cannot come from a guitar that only repeats what's easy to hear. And it definitely cannot come from a god too scared to step outside his own church. Keith Richards. If you think that two famous people like Jimmy Page and Keith Richards would naturally respect each other, get ready for that thought to be crushed. Between them lies a quiet war that's lasted 50 years. No fights, no public scandals, just cold stares, sharp, mean comments, and ignoring each other on purpose. Page once said, "Some people play music to tell stories, while others just play three chords and call it art." He didn't say Richards' name, but everyone knew he was talking about the man he saw as messy and full of himself. Meanwhile, Richards didn't hold back either. He once sneered that Led Zeppelin, despite Page's flashy leadership, had no soul, just stylized noise made for selling records. He told Rolling Stone magazine plainly, "Jimmy is a talented guitar player, but I always felt there was something kind of empty in their music, especially with John Bonham sounding like an out-of-control big truck." You'd think the mean comments would end there, but the 1975 Madison Square Garden event poured gasoline on their long-burning hate. That night, Page reached out his hand politely, a glass of whiskey shining in the light. Richard smirked and said, "I don't shake hands with a thief." The room froze. Silence fell as all eyes turned to the two musicians, and from that moment, Page didn't just feel insulted. He understood that his career had been questioned in front of the heart of the Rolling Stones. Page responded with silence, but Richards' look had been burned into his memory. Page later admitted he respected Richards' sense of guitar parts and natural timing, things that gave his stage presence a smooth and fiery appeal. But at the same time, Page made it clear they lived in two different worlds, not just musically, but in their beliefs. From then on, whenever he got the chance, Richards took shots at Zeppelin. In one particularly mean remark, he compared Led Zeppelin to a fake band that became popular at just the right time to fill an empty spot in the market. He called them hollow, empty of substance, driven only by loudness and effects. Page didn't stay quiet either. In a valuable 1977 interview with NME magazine, he said that anyone could bang out a few random notes on a guitar and call it satisfaction. But real music required creativity, a jump beyond soulless repetition. And when asked about the Stones, he dismissed them bluntly. Three chords, one guitar part, and an attitude. A harsh criticism, suggesting that Richards and the Stones lived in being okay with being average, lacking growth. Richards responded with a cold stare. Zeppelin may have been a sound machine willing to turn up the volume, but they forgot what truly moves people. the old-school toughness in every note. With the words, "They can build rocket engines, but they forgot to write songs that make people cry," Richards put a full stop to any praise for fancy production. The two men have never even stood on the same stage. They've shared music nights, mutual friends, backstage spaces, but never walked side by side. When Zeppelin ended after Bonham's death, Richards only sighed. "I guess they needed more than a drummer to keep the music from falling apart." A remark that sounded casual, even sympathetic, but hit like a blade cutting through Zeppelin's legacy. Eventually, when a French reporter dared to ask Page, "What do you think of Clapton? Sorry, I mean Richards." Page didn't frown, just sipped his tea and said, "Keith Richards might be one of the best guitar players I've ever known, but Zeppelin, they run like a big truck, too loud, and sometimes they lose their soul." He added, "If you ask who Jimmy Page is, the short answer is Jimmy," a statement that didn't need anger to make itself known. Page stood alone with no need for Richards as a foundation and no desire for a partnership. Their fight was never loud or public, just a quiet inability to get along lasting 50 years, forming a legend. Page, the perfectionist risk-taker, mastering everything from microphone placement to recording layers. Richards, the raw soul, vintage, guitar playing, cigarette in hand, forgetting the studio clock. Two extremes of British rock, unable to get along, but together making rock history exciting with every breath. Yngwie Malmsteen. In the late 1980s, while Jimmy Page was busy proving Led Zeppelin to be the forever symbol of British rock, another name shot up like lightning: Yngwie Malmsteen. The Swedish guitar player with dizzy technique and classical music style grabbed the spotlight with a level of showing off that was almost unreal. Not long after, he didn't just claim to be the best. He took aim at Page's legacy. "I don't care about blues scales. I don't want to bend one note and call it emotion. That's not guitar playing. That's just being lazy." Though he didn't say names, Page and anyone who loved the subtleties of blues knew exactly who he was talking about. Page never responded. He didn't need to. But according to those who worked closely with him, he turned pale with anger. Not because a 20-something had insulted his music, but because that young man had insulted everything Page believed in. Feel over flash, soul over speed. Malmsteen was once asked about his influences. When Jimmy Page was listed among 10 guitar players he admired, he replied bluntly, "I respect Led Zeppelin, but as a guitar player, too sloppy for me. I prefer Paganini over Pentatonix." A surgical strike meant to make Page look like an old relic from the past decade. At Abbey Road Studios, an engineer remembered, Page raised an eyebrow at the mention of Malmsteen's name, then muttered, "If you play 3,000 notes and none of them mean anything, what's the point?" A question that seemed to say, if technique doesn't show feeling, what value does it have? Others remembered Page saying, "It's like watching someone juggle chainsaws. Impressive? Maybe. Music? Nowhere to go." His sense of what sounds good collapsed when facing a cold mechanical performance. The most striking moment came in 1991 during a charity event in London. Both men were there, not knowing the other would be there. Yngwie entered the green room in a velvet suit and sunglasses indoors. Page turned and breathed out quietly, "Oh, great! Dracula plays a Stratocaster." Seconds later, Yngwie turned back, smirked, and said a line that would become legend. "At least Dracula practices." The room fell dead silent. For the first time, amateur guitar dreamers saw a quiet war play out in real time, a roadie remembered. Page clenched his jaw and walked away. No shouting, no chaos, just a tension so thick you could feel it. After that, Malmsteen continued throwing darts across the screen. In interviews, he said plainly, "These so-called classical pioneers are outdated. They play what they know. I play what's possible." Page stayed silent, leaving it to the traditional guitar community to respond. Brian May and Joe Satriani both described Malmsteen as technically brilliant, but emotionally lacking. Years passed and the two men stayed in separate worlds, never working together, never sharing a stage, never talking directly. But when asked during the 2008 Led Zeppelin reunion promotion about today's speed-obsessed players, Page paused, then said, "Some people are very fast, but you can't play emotion at 200 beats per minute." A slight smirk followed, as if to confirm. He knew the gap between speed and soul. That anger never died. Even though Malmsteen once listed Page among the guitar players he respected, there was a clear divide in his words. "I like Page for the way he saw beyond just being a guitar player. He understood the whole song." Yet still, with all his technical showing off and lack of vulnerability, Malmsteen never lined up with the Page school of thought. Editors, radio hosts, and guitar critics alike noted, "This wasn't just a clash of styles. It was a complete split between technique and soul, between fire and ice." One fan once commented, "If Page is the builder of sound cathedrals, Malmsteen is the man running barefoot across razor wire." The divide wasn't just between two artists. It was between two beliefs. One built castles, the other launched fireworks, and they would never share the same stage. Jimi Hendrix. When Jimi Hendrix first stepped on stage in London in 1967, the entire city seemed to freeze. An American with a flaming afro, a flipped-over Fender guitar, and a sound the world had never heard. The crowd was stunned. Some clapped endlessly, but in a dim corner backstage, one man stood still, eyes staring through a cloud of cigarette smoke. No clapping, no words. That man was Jimmy Page. They were never friends, nor were they open enemies, but between them lay a thin sheet of ice, cracking with tension. While one set stages on fire, the other was carefully building walls of sound like a maze. And as Hendrix bent the rules, Page was rewriting them in black ink, driven by obsession. In those years, London was a pressure cooker. Who came first? Who played better? Who changed the world more? These weren't things for the newspapers to decide, but things artists felt in each other through whispers behind the curtain. An old friend once remembered that Page said during a late-night tea, "This American comes over here and suddenly everyone forgets who was playing guitar before he arrived." A gentle sentence, but every word carried a blade. Jimmy Page never spoke much about Hendrix in public. He didn't need to. Pieces of quotes scattered over time painted a chilling picture. "Some people think breaking guitars makes you a genius," he said in a 1969 interview. "Real musicians don't need fireworks." No names needed. Everyone knew who the target was. For Page, music wasn't about lighting a stage on fire. It was ritual, architecture, total control. What Hendrix called feel, Page labeled chaos. Where Hendrix played with fire, Page saw only flash over form. It wasn't just disagreement. It was a war of beliefs. One believed in raw magic. The other worshipped perfection down to the placement of a microphone. The quiet tension began to spill into rumors. A sound engineer remembered that during a concert at Olympic Studios, when a piece of Hendrix's Voodoo Child came through the speakers, Page said only one sentence before standing up and leaving. Distortion without direction. No anger, no outburst, just a silent judgment. Hendrix was different. In interviews, he often mentioned Jimmy Page with calm respect. He once even called Led Zeppelin very tight, but no one ever knew if he sensed the icy distance coming from the other side. Perhaps he didn't, or perhaps Hendrix simply didn't care. And then in 1970, Jimi Hendrix died. A lightning strike in the night without warning. As artists and critics rushed to call him the guitar saint, the man who rewrote the course of music, Page stayed silent. No tribute article, no public statement, not even sympathy. In a rare instance where he was asked about Hendrix's legacy, he simply replied, "It was a unique moment in time." a sentence so empty it was unclear whether it was praise or dismissal. When the rankings began listing Hendrix as the greatest guitar player of all time, Page quietly slid into second place. For others, that would be an honor. For Page, perhaps it was a cruel reminder that the world had chosen its god, and it wasn't him. And the jealousy, if it existed, didn't come from who played better. It came from who would be remembered, who became a legend before getting old, who stormed into history like a hurricane, while the other continued laying bricks on his sound cathedral. Perhaps what haunted Page wasn't Hendrix's sound, but how he made people forget all other sounds that came before. Jimmy Page may have never said, "I hate Hendrix," but every subtle jab, every smirk, every time he walked out when Hendrix's music played said it all. In the world of geniuses, perhaps this is how they declare war: through music, through silence, and through pride that never bows. Eddie Van Halen. When Eddie Van Halen exploded onto the rock scene in the late 1970s like a storm in the sky, the world saw a phenomenon. But Jimmy Page saw a threat. The world praised Eddie as a revolutionary, a man who redefined the electric guitar with lightning speed tapping, electrifying speed, and solos like Eruption that made an entire generation look up and reconsider everything. But to Jimmy Page, that wasn't evolution. It was betrayal. One night in 1978 at a pub in London, a few session musicians gathered with Page to check out a new tape from California. As the first tapping segment played, someone in the room said, "This kid's got something." Page stayed silent, took a drag from his cigarette, and slowly said a sentence like an earthquake beneath the surface. "Anyone can learn party tricks. Real guitar playing comes from the heart, not from showing off like a circus performer." The quote spread like wildfire, and it didn't take long to reach Eddie. In an interview afterward, Eddie responded gently, "Jimmy Page inspired me, man. I got into the crazy stuff because of guys like him." He smiled, humble, not even a hint of anger. But that calmness seemed to make Page even more angry. Not because Eddie was disrespectful, but because he didn't play by the rules. Page grew up with the blues. Every note he played was a scar, a spell created from pain. He built sound like a ritual, slow, haunting, layered. Eddie, on the other hand, was like a kid playing with electricity. Joyful, daring, seemingly never wrong, but never wounded either. "There's a difference between playing guitar and playing with a guitar," Page reportedly told a backstage interviewer in 1979. He didn't name Eddie, but the industry knew exactly who he meant. And that wasn't the only time. At a 1980 recording session in Los Angeles, a young technician innocently played a clip of Eruption to test the speakers. Page, mid-review of a demo reel, stood up, crushed his cigarette, and said flatly, "I've heard enough bedroom noodling for one lifetime." No one laughed. No one replied. No one played that song again for the rest of the day. To Page, Eddie wasn't an enemy. Eddie was the embodiment of a future he couldn't accept. A future where music didn't require suffering, depth, or mystery, only speed and spectacle. And Page, who had carefully built the Led Zeppelin empire on emotion and mystery, could not forgive that. "Eddie's fast," he once said to a sound engineer at Abbey Road. "But if you take away the effects, the speed, the flash, what's left?" A question that was really a judgment. What's remarkable is that Eddie never fought back. He continued to call Page a master, continued to mention Led Zeppelin as an influence in interviews. But perhaps that humility only made Page feel even more displaced. Eddie didn't need to fight. He didn't need to compete. He simply surpassed. A guitar player who had watched both perform once said, "Page played with ghosts. Eddie played like he was trying to outrun them." And that's the heart of it. While Page clung to shadows, mystery, and sounds dragged from the abyss, Eddie raced into the light with a grin, and a speed no one could catch. In a fair world, they might have coexisted. But in Jimmy Page's heart, there was no room for two kings, and Eddie Van Halen, without meaning to, without declaring war, took the throne. In the eyes of the public, in the hearts of a younger generation, and in the deepest, most unspoken fear of a legend being replaced. When Eddie died in 2020, the world mourned. Jimmy Page posted a simple tribute. No fancy words, no bitterness, just a short paragraph about the legacy Eddie left behind for guitar. But those who had heard Page speak in the shadows, who had seen him leave the room when Van Halen came on, knew that tribute did not come from the heart. Perhaps Page never truly hated Eddie. He only hated what Eddie represented. A generation he couldn't control, couldn't figure out, and no longer belonged to, Ritchie Blackmore. In the blazing fire of the 1970s, when the guitar was a weapon and its players the knights of rock, two names constantly avoided each other like the same poles of a magnet: Jimmy Page and Ritchie Blackmore. Both were masters, builders of sound, who carved their names into history. But between them there was never respect, only caution, contempt, and a fight that neither dared to name. It all began in the least hostile of places, the studio. Both Page and Blackmore were session musicians in their early careers. They knew of each other. They had met. And according to a technician at Olympic Studios, from the first moment they locked eyes, not a single word was spoken. But the look Page gave was like someone had walked in with a guitar that hadn't been tuned. Not long after, the whispers began. When Page heard a demo of Blackmore's early Deep Purple Smoke on the Water recordings, he allegedly told a colleague, coldly, "Blackmore thinks every song needs a bloody sword fight." A harsh jab, not only mocking Ritchie's aggressive playing style, but also making fun of his theatrical, battle-ready persona. To Page, who believed every sound should be precise, ritualistic, what Blackmore brought to the table was nothing more than drama. And Page didn't play with drama. That contempt only deepened as Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple rose at the same time. While Page immersed himself in intricate compositions like Kashmir and Achilles' Last Stand, Blackmore went the other way. Leaner, louder, and sometimes, as Page once put it, Renaissance fair nonsense. A German magazine in 1975 quoted Page, saying, "There are guitar players who serve the song, and there are guitar players who make the song serve them." No names were mentioned, but none were needed. Everyone in the business knew it was aimed at Ritchie, the man who routinely hijacked the spotlight with 10-minute solos on stage, as if testing the audience's patience was part of the act. That attitude reached its breaking point during a backstage encounter in London in 1974. Blackmore arrived late to a sound check for a charity concert. Page, already present, stood up the moment Ritchie entered. No greeting, no handshake, just a turn to his assistant and a cutting sentence. "I don't have time for costume parties." That phrase became legend in British rock circles. Costume party? Not just a dig at Blackmore's stage clothes, but a complete dismissal of his artistic identity. To Page, Ritchie wasn't a musician. He was a court jester in medieval armor. As for Ritchie Blackmore, he seemed unfazed. In interviews, he repeatedly praised Page as a very clever recording technician. Some believed he meant it sincerely. Others suspected Ritchie was playing a reverse chess game. The less you react, the more it drives your opponent mad. But Page didn't need insults to feed his resentment. He remembered every word, every gesture. A close friend once said, "Jimmy believed Ritchie had no soul, just speed, just drama." And, in Jimmy Page's world, lacking soul was an unforgivable sin. Not everyone noticed the tension. There were no fights, no public arguments. But every time Page was asked about Deep Purple, he responded with cold silence. Even when Led Zeppelin was compared to them, a common habit of the press, he'd only smirk, sometimes adding a vague remark, "They're loud." Later, when Blackmore formed Rainbow and began crafting tracks like Stargazer and Gates of Babylon, with full orchestras, choirs, and over-the-top theatrics, Page couldn't hide his disdain. Throwing violins at a problem doesn't make it music, he reportedly said at a party in 1977. And yet the irony was this. Both were fighting for the same thing. Both wanted the guitar to be the soul of the song. They just chose different paths. Page was a sorcerer hidden behind layers of effects and shifting tempos. Blackmore was a stage knight, bold, direct, with no need for metaphors. But because of that, they could never meet. They clashed simply by existing. And so for decades the fight smoldered like a guitar string stretched too tightly, silent yet, always on the verge of snapping. No solo battles, no shouting matches, just distant glances, unnamed quotes, and precisely aimed jabs. All enough to prove one thing. Jimmy Page never considered Ritchie Blackmore a peer, only a man muddying the waters he believed were meant to remain pure. And so the 6 names have been spoken, not in reverence, but as a warning. These are the ones who provoked the deepest disdain from a legend like Jimmy Page, not out of personal vendetta, but because they dared to violate what he holds sacred: music. Which name surprised you the most? Do you side with Jimmy Page, or do you think he was too harsh? Drop a comment below and tell us who is your greatest guitar player of all time, and who do you think never should have picked up a guitar in the first place? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to uncover more untold truths from the raw, electrifying world of rock.